There is a moment many men can't quite name, but they feel it in their body. It's the moment when discipline, which once felt like a source of dignity and direction, starts to feel sharp. The same drive that helped you build strength, stability, and respect now burns instead of warms. You're still moving forward, still producing, still pushing, but something inside has gone quiet, or tense, or tired in a way that sleep doesn't touch. At first, motivation feels like a fire you learned to tend. It got you out of bed. It kept your word to yourself. It gave structure to chaos. But slowly, almost invisibly, that fire stops being a tool and starts becoming a test. You don't just act anymore, you prove. You don't just rest, you negotiate. Effort turns into self-surveillance. Discipline becomes a way of withholding approval from yourself until further notice. This is where many men get confused because nothing is obviously wrong. On the outside, things may even look better than ever. But internally, motivation has shifted from direction to punishment. You're no longer asking, what matters? You're asking, is it enough yet? And the answer keeps moving. Our culture quietly reinforces this shift. We're taught, early and often, that more effort fixes everything. If you're struggling, push harder. If you're empty, optimize. If you're hurting, discipline yourself out of it. Over time, effort stops being a response to life and becomes a ritual, an offering, as if there's an invisible judge keeping score, watching how much you sacrifice before you're allowed to feel at ease. What changes here isn't just behavior, it's meaning. Striving that once came from purpose begins to come from fear. Fear of falling behind, fear of becoming irrelevant, fear of what might surface if you stop moving. The body keeps going, but the nervous system stays braced, as if rest itself were dangerous. High-functioning men are especially vulnerable to missing this transition, not because they lack insight, but because competence can hide cost. You still perform, you still solve problems, you still show up. And so the question never becomes, is this sustainable? It becomes, why am I never satisfied? By the time the cost is obvious, it's often already been paid, quietly, over years, in strained relationships, a body that no longer recovers, a sense of self that feels more like a project than a home. What gets lost when motivation turns hostile to the self is subtle, but profound. Joy becomes conditional. Rest becomes guilt-ridden. Achievement brings relief instead of nourishment. Even success feels oddly hollow, as if it didn't quite land where it was supposed to. And because you're still moving forward, it's easy to assume this is just the price of strength, that this is what adulthood requires. But there's an emotional truth underneath all of this that rarely gets spoken aloud. When motivation is driven by fear, it slowly erodes trust with yourself. You stop feeling accompanied by your own efforts. You feel driven by them. And something in the psyche begins to tighten, waiting for permission that never comes. If any of this feels familiar, there's nothing wrong with you. This isn't a failure of willpower or character. It's a pattern, one that intelligent, disciplined men fall into precisely because discipline has worked for them before. The danger isn't effort itself. The danger is when effort becomes the only way you know how to feel worthy, safe, or real. So if you're listening and noticing a quiet resonance, stay with me. At the midpoint of this conversation, we'll expose a pattern that most disciplined men never realize they're trapped in. Not because they're weak, but because the trap is disguised as strength. There is a particular kind of inner pressure that doesn't sound emotional at all. It sounds practical, efficient, corrective. It speaks in the language of standards and responsibility. It doesn't yell, it monitors. It keeps score. And for many men, this voice feels so familiar that it's mistaken for conscience or character, rather than what it often is, an internal authority that formed in the absence of something steadier. For some, the father was physically absent. For others, he was present, but emotionally unreachable, unpredictable, or only approving when performance was high. In those environments, something adaptive happened early. The psyche learned to watch itself closely, to anticipate judgment, to earn safety through usefulness. Over time, this vigilance solidified into an inner structure that never really turns off. What looks like discipline, then, is not simply about goals or values. It becomes a form of self-surveillance. You don't just ask whether something is effective. You ask whether you're allowed to rest, to enjoy, to slow down. Worth becomes conditional, measured against output. Belonging is earned, not assumed. From a Jungian perspective, this often lives in what could be called a negative animus or internalized authority complex. In everyday language, it's the part of you that believes approval must be deserved through effort. This voice doesn't say, "You're bad." It says, "You're not done." And because it learned its logic early, it feels unquestionable. Here's the paradox. What feels like self-mastery is often outsourced self-acceptance. Instead of being rooted in an inner sense of worth, regulation is handed over to rules, routines, and relentless standards. As long as you're performing, the system works. You feel momentarily safe. But the moment you stop, rest appears not as restoration, but as exposure. Clinicians who work with high-performing men often describe a striking pattern. These are men who excel professionally, who handle pressure with composure, who are admired for their reliability. Yet when rest enters the picture, something collapses emotionally. Anxiety spikes, irritability rises. There's a vague sense of guilt or unease that has no clear object. Stillness feels unsafe, not because they're lazy, but because stillness removes the conditions under which they learned to feel acceptable. The inner drill sergeant doesn't just demand action, it quietly rewires how reward feels. Accomplishment brings relief rather than satisfaction. Praise lands briefly, then evaporates. There's no sense of being met, only the sense of having survived another round. And because the voice is internal, it feels like me, rather than something that formed in response to unmet needs. This is why simply telling yourself to be kinder or more balanced rarely works. The system wasn't built for comfort. It was built for survival and belonging. It learned that approval followed performance, not presence. That pattern doesn't dissolve through insight alone. It loosens through recognition and patience. It's also why many men resist naming this dynamic. There's a fear that without this internal pressure, everything would fall apart. That motivation would vanish. That discipline would dissolve. But what's usually at risk isn't productivity, it's identity. If striving is how you learn to be seen, then slowing down can feel like disappearing. What's important to hold here is that this pattern once made sense. It helped you adapt. It helped you function. It may have even saved you in environments where softness or dependency wasn't safe. The cost only appears later, when the same strategy is applied to a life that now requires intimacy, rest, and emotional presence. You may notice how this voice shows up most strongly around rest, pleasure, or moments with no clear outcome. It's not satisfied with direction alone. It wants justification, proof. And because it never learned what unconditional support feels like, it keeps trying to manufacture it through effort. There's nothing defective about this. It's an intelligent system that outlived its original context. The work isn't to silence it or fight it, but to understand what it's protecting and what it's afraid would happen if it stopped. As we move forward, keep this in the background. 2 chapters from now, we'll place this internal structure next to a real survivor account that reframes grit in a way most disciplined men have never considered. That comparison tends to reveal something quietly unsettling and clarifying about where drive ends and compulsion begins. There is a particular kind of momentum that feels powerful, but strangely thin. You're moving fast, you're checking boxes, you're staying ahead of problems, and yet when there's finally a pause, nothing settles. The body doesn't soften, the mind doesn't land. It's as if the reward never quite arrives. This is where many men start to suspect something is off, even if they can't articulate it. The drive is still there, sometimes stronger than ever, but it no longer brings a sense of being restored. Instead of satisfaction, there's agitation. Instead of fullness, there's an urge to move again. Stillness doesn't feel neutral, it feels exposed. Beneath this pattern is often a hidden shadow dynamic, a fear of stillness that disguises itself as productivity. Movement becomes a way of not feeling, not because you're avoiding life, but because stopping removes the structure that keeps the nervous system regulated. When effort is constant, the body stays oriented around threat and resolution. When effort stops, the system doesn't know where to go. From a biological angle, this often shows up as dopamine without oxytocin. Dopamine fuels pursuit, focus, and anticipation. It's sharp, activating, and efficient. Oxytocin, by contrast, is about safety, connection, and settling. When achievement is divorced from safety, you get accomplishment without refuge. The goal is reached, but the body remains braced. The reversal is subtle and easy to miss. Motivation spikes while satisfaction flatlines. You may notice that wins feel oddly quiet. Relief comes, but it's brief. And soon after, there's a pull toward the next task, the next optimization, the next problem to solve. The nervous system never exits threat mode. It just gets better at functioning inside it. There are signals here that almost no one talks about, because they don't look dramatic. Irritability during rest, a vague guilt after success, as if enjoyment were undeserved, a compulsive urge to refine, improve, or fix things that are already adequate. None of this looks like dysfunction on the surface. It looks like drive, but internally, it feels brittle. This is one reason hustle culture finds such fertile ground. It offers social permission for what is, at its core, a trauma-adapted rhythm. Constant motion is praised. Exhaustion is normalized. Slowing down is framed as laziness or weakness. In that environment, a dysregulated nervous system can hide in plain sight, applauded rather than questioned. What's important to understand is that the emptiness isn't a moral failure. It isn't ingratitude. It isn't a lack of ambition. It's the predictable result of a reward system that never learned how to signal safety. When the body doesn't register arrival, motivation can't metabolize into contentment. It stays sharp, controlling, hungry. Over time, this changes your relationship with effort itself. Work becomes a way of managing internal pressure rather than expressing values. Productivity becomes anesthetic, and because it works, in the short term, the pattern reinforces itself. You feel worse when you stop, so you keep going. The system interprets motion as regulation. This is where Jung's language of the shadow becomes useful in everyday terms. The shadow isn't something dark or malicious. It's what remains unintegrated. In this case, it's the unmet need for safety, rest, and relational nourishment that achievement alone cannot provide. When those needs stay unacknowledged, they don't disappear. They drive behavior from underneath. You may notice how this shows up most clearly after moments that are supposed to feel good. The promotion, the finished project, the personal record. Instead of a deep exhale, there's a restless scan for what's next. Control tightens. Enjoyment feels risky, as if letting it in might cost you momentum. When reward no longer restores you, motivation mutates into control. Not because you want power, but because control promises predictability. And predictability feels like safety to a nervous system that never learned to rest without conditions. This doesn't mean drive is the enemy. It means drive without safety becomes corrosive. The task ahead isn't to eliminate ambition, but to notice what your ambition is being asked to carry. When achievement is forced to do the work of regulation, belonging, and self-trust, it will always feel insufficient. As we move closer to the center of this conversation, the pattern becomes even clearer. What looks like high standards often has very little to do with excellence at all, and what's usually called perfectionism turns out to be something much more protective and much more fragile than most men realize. There is a belief that often sits beneath relentless self-discipline, rarely spoken, but deeply felt. It sounds like this: if I don't push, I disappear. Not metaphorically, nervously, existentially, as if presence itself depends on pressure. This is where perfectionism is commonly misunderstood. It's framed as ambition, rigor, or integrity. But when you look closer, it behaves less like a standard and more like a defense. Not a defense against failure, but against exposure, against the feeling of being seen without armor. Through a trauma-informed lens, perfectionism begins to make a different kind of sense. It isn't about doing things well. It's about preventing shame from surfacing. When the system believes that mistakes threaten belonging, control becomes a form of protection. Tight standards keep uncertainty at bay. They create the illusion of safety by narrowing the field of risk. This is why over-discipline and procrastination often coexist in the same person, even though they look like opposites. Both emerge from the same nervous system root. When the stakes feel existential, the system oscillates. Either it clamps down with intensity, or it freezes altogether. One looks like relentless action. The other looks like paralysis. Both are attempts to avoid the same internal exposure. There's a story that circulates quietly online, shared by a man who once believed discipline would save him. Each failure in his life became a cue to train harder, longer hours, stricter routines, fewer allowances for rest or connection. On the surface, his life looked increasingly impressive. Internally, something vital began to erode. Conversations grew shallow. Intimacy felt intrusive. Eventually, relationships faded not through conflict, but through absence. There was no space left where softness could land. What's striking in accounts like this isn't the intensity of effort, but the moral weight attached to it. Certain tasks don't just feel important, they feel charged. Skipping them doesn't register as a neutral choice. It feels like a violation, a character flaw, a kind of disappearance. That's often the signal that the nervous system isn't responding to meaning, but to threat. Control tends to escalate when uncertainty feels unsafe. And nothing exposes uncertainty like relationships. Unlike goals, people can't be optimized. They introduce variables, needs, delays, ambiguity. For a system built on perfection, this can feel intolerable. So, effort doubles, standards tighten, emotional range narrows. At this midpoint, something important becomes visible. What's been labeled as discipline may not be serving growth at all. It may be holding the system in place, preventing a deeper form of development from occurring. Jung might describe this as the ego mistaking control for integration. The persona becomes refined, but the self remains unattended. This is often where the cycle intensifies. More effort is applied to solve a problem that effort itself is creating. The body grows tense, the inner world shrinks, and yet stopping still feels dangerous, as if easing pressure would expose something unmanageable underneath. What's being protected here isn't laziness or weakness. It's a younger part of the psyche that learned early that visibility came with cost. Perfection became a strategy to stay ahead of shame, not to reach fulfillment. And strategies like this don't dissolve through force. They loosen through awareness and safety. As the conversation turns forward, this pattern doesn't stay confined to work or self-improvement. It follows the same logic into love, attachment, and longing. And when it does, it tends to repeat with even greater intensity. What comes next explains why this dynamic so often reaches its breaking point in relationships, where effort can no longer substitute for presence. When this form of motivation enters relationships, it rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive as control or domination. It arrives as endurance, as loyalty, as the willingness to stay longer, try harder, and tolerate more than most people would. On the surface, it can look like devotion. Internally, it often feels like a test that must be passed. From a Jungian frame, this is where anima projection quietly takes hold. The anima, in everyday terms, is the inner image of connection, vitality, and emotional meaning. When that inner relationship is underdeveloped or unsafe, it gets projected outward. Love becomes something to earn, rather than something to participate in. The partner carries the promise of wholeness, but only if enough effort is applied. This is why toxic motivation so often gravitates toward impossible partners or no-win goals. The difficulty isn't accidental. Difficulty keeps the system engaged. Intermittent reward, a familiar pattern in trauma bonds, sustains compulsion far more effectively than consistency ever could. When affection, availability, or approval comes and goes, the nervous system locks in. Effort increases. Boundaries soften. The hope of resolution intensifies. Achievement addiction and trauma bonding follow the same internal logic. Both rely on unpredictable reinforcement. Both convince the psyche that persistence will eventually bring relief. And both slowly train the system to confuse intensity with meaning. The harder it is, the more valuable it feels. Philosophers like Schopenhauer observed this long before modern psychology gave it language. Striving without consciousness multiplies suffering. When effort is disconnected from awareness, it doesn't lead toward fulfillment. It circles around lack. Desire feeds on itself, mistaking endurance for purpose. This pattern isn't limited to one culture. In many collectivist contexts, men describe confusing duty with devotion. Responsibility becomes the measure of love. Self-erasure is reframed as virtue, and questioning the cost of this arrangement feels selfish or disloyal. The inner drill sergeant finds external reinforcement here. praising sacrifice while ignoring depletion. Rejection plays a crucial role in sustaining this cycle. When closeness falters or distance appears, the response isn't repair, it's overfunctioning, more effort, more accommodation, more proving. The system doesn't pause to ask whether the relationship is reciprocal. It asks how to endure better. Over time, the quiet toll becomes apparent. Energy narrows. Identity contracts around the role of provider, fixer, or pursuer. There's little room left for mutual curiosity or play. Eventually, the system breaks, not through dramatic collapse, but through a slow dimming. Attraction fades. Resentment creeps in. Exhaustion becomes the background hum of daily life. What makes this so painful is that it's driven by longing, not malice. The desire underneath is simple and human, to be met without having to perform. But when that desire has never felt safe internally, it gets acted out externally through effort and endurance. This is where motivation becomes most toxic, not because it pushes you forward, but because it keeps you tethered to situations that cannot nourish you. The same discipline that once built resilience now binds you to cycles that quietly erode self-trust. As this pattern reaches its limit, the psyche begins to intervene, not gently at first, often through fatigue, numbness, or a loss of drive that feels confusing and frightening. What appears next is often labeled as failure or burnout. In reality, it's something far more intelligent at work. Burnout is usually framed as a failure, a breakdown, proof that something has gone wrong. But when you listen more closely, it doesn't behave like collapse at all. It behaves like a system intervening when a pattern can no longer be sustained. What many men experience as exhaustion is not a lack of strength. It's the body and psyche reaching a limit where compensation is no longer possible. The energy that once fueled relentless effort begins to dry up, not out of laziness, but out of intelligence. Something inside recognizes that continuing would require a deeper form of self-violation. From a Jungian perspective, this aligns with what's called the compensation principle. When the ego becomes one-sided, over-identified with control, productivity, or endurance, the psyche seeks balance. If listening hasn't worked, it escalates. Fatigue appears, motivation drops, focus fragments, not as punishment, but as correction. This is why burnout often feels so disorienting. The strategies that once worked suddenly don't. Pushing harder brings diminishing returns. Discipline no longer restores order. And because identity has been built around effort, the loss of drive can feel like a loss of self. There's fear here, not just of falling behind, but of not knowing who you are without constant striving. The reversal is important to name. Burnout doesn't reveal laziness. It reveals misalignment. It exposes where effort has been applied in service of fear rather than values, where endurance replaced discernment, where motion substituted for meaning. Myth has always tried to tell this story. The figure of Icarus is often reduced to a warning against ambition, but the deeper lesson is about ignoring limits as a form of wisdom. The failure wasn't desire itself. It was the refusal to heed feedback. Heat, height, and fragility were all communicating something long before the fall. In lived experience, this often shows up as a strange contrast. Effort increases, but meaning decreases. More hours are poured in, yet the sense of purpose thins out. Achievements feel heavier rather than lighter. What once energized now depletes. The psyche signals this mismatch not with words, but with weariness. What looks like a loss of drive may actually be the first honest signal of integration trying to occur. The system is no longer willing to run on borrowed energy. It's asking, quietly but firmly, for a different relationship to effort, one that includes limits, values, and rest as information rather than obstacles. This moment is often misunderstood because it doesn't arrive with clarity. It arrives with fog, with irritability, with a sense of being done, without knowing what comes next. And because our culture rarely honors these signals, they're quickly labeled as problems to fix rather than messages to interpret. But within this slowing is something precise. The psyche is refusing to continue a contract that no longer serves wholeness. It's pulling the emergency brake not to stop your life, but to prevent further drift away from yourself. If earlier chapters described how motivation becomes toxic, this is where the antidote begins to appear, not as renewed force but as recalibration. The loss of speed creates space, and in that space, something other than fear-driven discipline can begin to orient movement again. What that orientation looks like, and how motivation can be reclaimed without turning against the self, is where this conversation now needs to land. What becomes clear, looking back across this arc, is that motivation itself was never the enemy. What changed was its role. What once served as orientation slowly became force, direction turned into pressure, and discipline, which can be a form of devotion, hardened into something closer to self-coercion. Integration begins when motivation is no longer used as a weapon against the self. In a Jungian sense, this is the movement from domination to relationship. Energy stops being extracted through fear and begins to organize around values, not because effort disappears, but because it's no longer carrying the weight of worthiness. Fear-powered discipline has a particular texture. It's urgent, brittle, always watching the edge. Value-aligned movement feels different in the body. It's quieter, more rhythmic. It allows pauses without panic. It doesn't demand perfection to justify existence. It moves because something matters, not because stopping feels unsafe. Self-mastery, in this light, isn't about control or conquest. It's about regulation and direction working together. The nervous system is included, not overridden. Limits are treated as information, not obstacles. And effort becomes an expression of integrity rather than a bid for approval. There is a single image that captures this shift cleanly. The whip creates speed, but it also creates damage. The compass doesn't rush. It doesn't threaten. It simply points. The movement it invites may be slower, but it leads somewhere real. Less force. True arrival. What was lost in the beginning of this story wasn't motivation. It was trust. Trust that rest wouldn't erase you. Trust that value wasn't conditional. Trust that presence could exist without constant proof. That trust can be reclaimed, not through intensity, but through awareness and choice. If this reflection mapped something in your own experience, there's no need to resolve it all at once. Recognition itself is already movement, and when patterns are named clearly, they begin to loosen without violence. If one signal stood out to you, one moment, sensation, or phrase that felt uncomfortably familiar, you're not alone in that recognition. Naming it quietly, even briefly, helps others see what you just saw.